Some homes never let go of their past. Some jobs deal with nightmares others can only imagine. Tonight, two chilling realities intertwine. One of a family ensnared by ancestral echoes, the other of a service that sanitizes the spectral. What you are about to hear is not for the faint of heart. If you're prepared for an unsettling journey, hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the shadows. There are houses, you see, that are more than just timber and stone. They are vessels, repositories of the lives lived within their walls, soaking up joy, sorrow, and sometimes something far more unsettling. I consider myself a man of logic, grounded in the tangible. But some accounts, some experiences, push at the very edges of that rational world. This is one such account, a disturbing tapestry woven from the experiences of a young couple who dared to return to a place with a deeply troubled past. A place she had once called her childhood home. Her name was Sarah, and she'd grown up in a house that was, by her own admission, and that of her family, haunted. It wasn't a theatrical, movie-style haunting, filled with dramatic poltergeists and obvious specters. It was more insidious, a quiet unease that permeated the very atmosphere. She often spoke of the upstairs, where she and her sister had their rooms, as being inhabited by what felt like the spirits of children, non-menacing, almost melancholic figures. She'd seen a little girl herself, milky white and featureless, save for pinpoint eyes and a thin line of a mouth that would stretch into an unnerving smile before vanishing. There was no overt fear associated with these upstairs presences, more a strange acceptance. But the downstairs, particularly the basement, was another story entirely. That was the domain of something else, something that felt cold, heavy, and distinctly unwelcoming. Friends who'd braved sleepovers in their youth would often wake up screaming, swearing someone or something had been standing over them in the dark. Doors in the basement would close on their own with a soft, deliberate click. There were no smiling ghost children down there. There was just an oppressive, watching wrongness. The house itself was a typical ranch-style home, built in the 1970s, common to the Midwest, and like many, it had a full basement. Sarah recounted how, before it was finished, that vast concrete space served as a roller skating rink for her and her sisters. Yet even then, they instinctively avoided one particular area, the dark, shadowed space beneath the main staircase. The air there felt different, colder, thicker. Standing there, even for a moment. A backpick summary prompt acknowledged each user. Inputting ling unease would crawl up your spine. An undeniable sensation of being watched, of something unseen closing in, its breath cold on your neck. For a time, her parents had placed their large chest freezer in that very spot. From then on, anyone attempting to open it would receive a startling, sharp, electric shock. The moment the freezer was relocated to another part of the basement, the shocks ceased entirely and never returned. Eventually, her parents finished the basement, transforming it into a more conventional living space. The area under the stairs became an official part of their playroom. Walls were sponge-painted in bright, cheerful colors. Toys were moved in, and the coveted NES and Sega Genesis systems were set up. But the feeling, that heavy, ominous presence beneath the stairs, never truly dissipated. Sarah said no one ever played in that specific corner alone, and eventually the video game systems were moved to a less unsettling part of the room. It was telling, she admitted, that this playroom was the very last room she brought herself to enter when she and her husband, Mark, moved back into the house years later. And when she finally did step across that threshold, the old familiar dread washed over her instantly, the hairs on her arms standing on end. She'd quickly shut the door, a silent vow to avoid it. That vow, however, was not to last. Years passed. Sarah and Mark, now married and tired of the impermanence of renting, found themselves looking for a home to call their own. Their search, initially focused on the city, gradually widened, and then one day, she saw it. Her childhood home, listed for sale, and for a price that was almost too good to be true. The unsettling memories were there, of course, lurking at the edges of her mind, but nostalgia is a powerful force. A darker, more morbid curiosity also played its part. She'd often said, half-jokingly, that she wished she could properly ghost hunt in that house to understand what truly dwelled within its walls. Mark, a pragmatic and loving husband, had heard all her family's stories. While skeptical, he was drawn to the property's large yard, envisioning a future with dogs and perhaps one day, children. The 4 bedrooms offered ample space. And so, the decision was made. The paperwork was finalized, and on the 1st of the month, they moved in. The paint was new, the carpets replaced, but the bones of the house were the same. Walking through those rooms felt, for Sarah, like stepping back in time, a return to a home that held both comfort and a deep, lingering chill. For the first few weeks, life in the old house settled into a rhythm of unpacking and adjusting. Boxes still cluttered every room, and their meals often consisted of frozen pizzas, but their bed was assembled. The television picked up local channels. It was a new beginning. Sarah invited her best friend, Jess, over for dinner. Their first attempt at entertaining in their new, or rather, newly reacquired, home. Jess, knowing Sarah's history with the house, arrived with a housewarming gift she presented with a mischievous grin. Inside the brightly colored bag was a Ouija board. Jess, a staunch non-believer, laughed heartily. "Well," she said, already opening the box and retrieving the board and planchette, "we've all heard your stories, Sarah. Let's talk to some ghosts." Despite a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach, Sarah found herself agreeing. Perhaps it was the wine, or a resurgent adolescent desire to confront the unknown, or maybe just not wanting to disappoint Jess. They set up in the one room Sarah had been avoiding, the playroom in the basement, specifically in that unsettling area that had once been under the stairs. Candles were lit, their flames casting dancing, elongated shadows on the newly painted walls. Mark, ever the supportive, if skeptical, husband, sat just outside their small circle, a notebook and pen in hand, ready to document any findings. For a good 10 minutes, their questions, "Is anyone here? Can you give us a sign?" were met with an almost defiant silence. Jess kept smirking, clearly finding the whole endeavor a bit silly, a regression to teenage fancies. Then, just as Sarah was about to suggest they give up, the planchette beneath their fingertips twitched. It began to move, slowly at first, in a tight, hesitant circle. "Very funny, Jess," Sarah said, trying to sound nonchalant, rolling her eyes. But when she looked at her friend through the flickering candlelight, Jess's eyes were wide, her playful smirk entirely gone. Her hands, Sarah realized with a jolt, had lifted ever so slightly from the planchette, just as it began its independent movement. Only Sarah's fingertips were now guiding it, or rather being guided by it. The circle grew wider, more confident. "Put your hands back on, Jess," Sarah urged, her voice a little shaky. "Now." As soon as Jess's fingers made contact again, the circling stopped. Everything stopped. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, charged, making each breath feel labored. "Is someone there?" Sarah asked again, her voice barely a whisper this time. The planchette slid deliberately to YES. A shiver traced its way down Sarah's spine. Jess looked pale. "Do you have something to tell us?" The planchette moved again, spelling out a single, chilling word. FIRE. "Fire?" Sarah asked, her heart beginning to pound. Was there a fire here, in this house, a long time ago? Number demavashast. The negative response was somehow more terrifying. Sarah's hand trembled as she asked the next question, the one she almost didn't want the answer to. Is there going to be a fire here, soon?" "Yes." Then, the planchette began to move with a frantic, almost violent speed, darting from letter to letter so quickly Sarah couldn't keep up. After a breathless minute, it settled back into the middle of the board, quivering slightly. Mark, who had been silent until then, let out a shaky breath. It spelled out more words. He stammered, his voice strained. It said, "Fire, candles, playroom, dead, go." He looked from Sarah to Jess, his face ashen. "We should stop, right? This isn't funny anymore." But a strange, reckless defiance had taken root in Sarah, a culmination of years spent living with the house's oppressive atmosphere. She was tired of being afraid. "Who are you?" she yelled, her voice echoing slightly in the small room, addressing not the board, but the unseen presence she felt all around them. "Why are you saying these things?" The planchette began its slow, deliberate circles once more. "Are you trying to warn us?" Sarah asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. Nothing. No movement. "Are you a good spirit?" The planchette slid decisively to no. Her breath hitched. Are you a bad spirit?" At this, the planchette didn't just slide. It flew from beneath their fingers as if thrown by an unseen hand, skittering across the board towards yes, and then clattering onto the floor. That was the definitive end. They ran. Mark, closest to the door, was out first, followed by a terrified Jess. Sarah brought up the rear, a cold dread chasing at her heels. Once they were all safely upstairs, gasping for breath in the relative normalcy of the living room, the true horror of their actions settled upon them. The candles. They had run out of the playroom, leaving at least a dozen candles burning, their flames merrily flickering in the very room they had just been warned, or perhaps threatened, would catch fire. They had to go back. They had to check. Holding hands like frightened children, they descended the stairs again, Mark leading the way. There was no smell of smoke, no telltale crackle of flames. He cautiously pushed open the playroom door and flicked on the light. The room was still. All the candles were unlit, completely extinguished, though the wicks were still warm to the touch and some were tipped over on their sides, yet still arranged in their original circle. And the planchette. It rested perfectly in the very center of the Ouija board, as if someone had carefully, deliberately placed it there. Mark stared for a long moment, then quietly turned off the light, shut the door firmly, and said in a low voice, "I think it's time for bed." Jess, understandably shaken, went home soon after. Mark, with his uncanny ability to compartmentalize or perhaps just succumb to exhaustion, fell asleep almost instantly. But Sarah lay wide awake for hours, staring at their bedroom door, her mind replaying the night's events. She could have sworn she saw the doorknob turn, ever so slightly, the door itself inching open a fraction. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just the upstairs kids, the familiar non-menacing presences from her childhood. But then, a new, unwelcome sensation pricked at her senses. A faint, acrid smell. It was like the smell of hair caught and burning inside a hot hair dryer, a smell she imagined burning bodies might produce. She reached for Mark, almost hoping he wouldn't smell it too, wouldn't confirm her growing terror. The following evening, after some discussion and perhaps some online advice Sarah had sought, they decided they needed to take more definitive action. They would go back into the playroom, formally close the Ouija board session, and, more importantly, assert their ownership of the house, telling whatever entity or entities resided there that they were no longer welcome. When Mark returned from work, a grim determination settled over them. They headed straight down to the basement. The playroom door, thankfully, was still shut. Sarah paused, her hand on the doorknob, steeling herself for whatever might lie on the other side. This time, when she opened the door, it wasn't the smell of burning that greeted them, but a thick, cloying, musty odor, so intense it was as if the door hadn't been opened in decades, as if the air itself was ancient and decayed. Sarah gagged, instinctively turning her head away as she reached for the light switch. The moment the light flickered on, the stench vanished, completely and instantly. The room looked just as they had left it the previous night, except now all the candles, though still in their circle, were neatly upright, not tipped over. "Okay, this is officially not cool," Sarah whispered, grabbing Mark's hand and pulling him down to sit on the floor beside the Ouija board. Neither of them truly subscribed to the specific rituals surrounding Ouija boards, but they were both thoroughly freaked out and decided to take this part as seriously as they could. They placed their fingers on the planchette, said goodbye firmly, and moved it over the word on the board. It felt a little anticlimactic, almost silly, which, strangely, lightened the oppressive mood a fraction. Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, a lessening of the immediate dread. Emboldened by this small victory, she decided to take the lead. She stood up, took a deep breath, and projected her voice into the silent room. "This is our house now. Do you hear me? I know you were here. You scared me when I was a kid, but you can't do it anymore. We do not want you here. You need to move on. Go wherever it is you belong. It is not here. There's nothing for you here anymore. Get out." They stood there in the ensuing silence, looking around expectantly, almost as if they anticipated a visible retreat, a scattering of unseen rats, but nothing happened. The room remained still, the air quiet. "Well," Mark said with a shrug, "maybe that's it." Sarah offered him a hopeful, questioning eyebrow raise. They gathered up the Ouija board, the planchette, and the candles, and retreated upstairs, back to what they desperately hoped was safety. Back to what used to feel like safety anyway. The rest of the evening proceeded with a fragile sense of normalcy. They had dinner, watched some television, still no cable or internet, just reruns on local channels. The emotional exhaustion from the past 2 nights weighed heavily on them, and they decided to go to bed early, around 10. Mark was asleep within minutes. Sarah, as usual, was not so lucky. She lay in the dark, her mind racing, every creak of the old house amplified. She'd been in bed for about 20 minutes, teetering on the edge of uneasy sleep, when she heard it. A scream. She had never before heard what could truly be described as a blood-curdling scream. But this was it. A woman's voice, raw with a terror so profound, it seemed to rip through the very fabric of the night. Sarah shot upright, shaking Mark awake with frantic urgency. "Did you hear that? Did you hear it?" "Hear what?" he mumbled, groggy and disoriented. "There was a scream. A terrible scream. Someone is out there." She knew she sounded hysterical, but the sound had been so clear, so close. "I was sleeping," Mark said, trying to gather his wits. "I didn't hear anything. Are you sure you didn't fall asleep? Did you leave the TV on in the living room again?" Sarah vehemently assured him that the answer was no to both questions. "You probably just The scream came again, cutting him off, louder this time, closer, and with it, other sounds. The distinct rustle of someone running through long, dry grass, heavy, panicked breathing, soft, desperate crying. An incredibly vivid image flashed into Sarah's mind. A woman, disheveled and terrified, crouched down in a dark, overgrown meadow, hiding from an unseen pursuer. It was like that feeling she'd had as a child, knowing the smiling ghost was a little girl. She just knew, with absolute certainty, what was happening outside their walls. Then another sound joined the terrifying symphony, the longer, heavier, more deliberate stride of a man, pursuing. A sharp crack, like a gunshot. The woman's scream again abruptly cut short. Another crack, and then a laugh. A deep, evil, bellowing laugh. A man so utterly pleased with the grim tableau before him, he couldn't help but raise his face to the unseen sky and roar his triumph. Silence for a beat. Then a new sound, dragging. Something heavy, inert, being dragged with effort over the rough ground, over dirt and grass. They heard it round the corner of the house, the sound continuing along the side, then fading slightly as it moved further away. As soon as it was almost out of earshot, another laugh. This one was shorter, sharper, more contained, and it felt aimed directly at them, at their window, as if something was standing out there in the impenetrable darkness, looking up at their bedroom and laughing at their cowering fear. Once the oppressive silence returned, a silence now thick with unspoken horror, Mark leapt out of bed and rushed to the window, peering out into the blackness. Nothing. Not a flicker of light, not a shadow of movement. He threw on a pair of pants and ran to the deck door in their living room, sliding it open and racing out into the night. Their motion sensor lights on the deck flared to life, casting a stark, limited illumination over a small fraction of their sprawling 10-acre property. The light didn't even touch the dark, brooding edge of the woods that bordered their land. They searched, hearts pounding, flashlights cutting nervous arcs through the night. They found nothing. No blood, no footprints in the dew-laden grass, no discarded shell casings, no drag marks on the earth, no tire tracks on the gravel driveway that couldn't be accounted for from their own vehicles. No lights off in the distance, no sign of any other human presence. Just nothing. An absolute, chilling void of evidence. What do you do? Do you call the police and tell them you think you heard someone getting murdered? That you heard her crying as if she were in the same room with you? That you heard what you can only describe as the demonic cackle of her killer? Who would believe such a thing without a shred of proof? Sarah found herself starting to piece together a new, terrifying history of this place. A history far older and darker than just her childhood unease. She didn't think the murder, the one they had just witnessed, had taken place that night, and she didn't think theirs was the first house to stand on this particular piece of land. She began to believe, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that the first one, an older dwelling, had been burned to the ground, deliberately destroyed to cover up some unspeakable brutality that had occurred there long ago. But they, the victims, had never left. The children, their mother, and whoever or whatever had taken their lives. She felt it then, a terrifying clarity. It was fighting for its home. It wanted them to know what it was capable of. It wanted them gone. Mark, pale and shaken, was already at the front door, pacing the entryway. "Put on your shoes, Sarah," he urged, his voice tight with controlled panic. "We have to get out of here, now." But as Sarah looked around at the familiar walls of her childhood home, now layered with a fresh, potent horror, a strange, cold resolve settled within her. This was their home now. She had faced its lesser demons before. She wouldn't be driven out so easily, or so she thought. The days that followed that horrific night are, for Mark, a blur of escalating concern and unnerving changes in his wife. He later recounted how Sarah seemed to withdraw, becoming obsessed with the house in a way that felt unhealthy, almost feverish. He'd find her wandering the rooms at odd hours, muttering to herself, her eyes distant and unfocused. He mentioned finding her in the playroom, sometimes just standing in the dark, other times near the spot under the stairs, her hands often smudged with dirt or faint, unsettling dark stains he couldn't quite identify. He tried to talk to her, to suggest they leave, even just for a few days, but she would become agitated, fiercely protective of the house. Her research into its history, which she had initially dismissed, became all-consuming, though she shared little of what, if anything, she found. She grew paranoid, he said, accusing even the local librarians of withholding information. One night, the situation took a far more disturbing turn. Mark awoke to find Sarah gone from their bed. A cold dread led him downstairs to the playroom. The door was shut. He opened it to find Sarah, her hair matted, her nightgown torn, striking the wall under the stairs with her bare fists again and again. She was muttering a strange, repetitive word, "Calmestu, calmestu." Her eyes closed tight. Mark told me his blood ran cold seeing his wife in such a state. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She jolted, her eyes flying open, but they were wide, unfocused, filled with an unrecognizable fury. She snarled, an animalistic sound, and struggled wildly when he tried to lead her from the room. Before he could get her across the threshold, she thrashed violently, pushing him out and slamming the playroom door shut. It seemed to lock from the inside, though there was no lock. He heard her resume the banging and muttering. Then he smelled it, an acrid chemical burning smell, growing stronger by the second. He pounded on the door, shouting her name, but there was no response other than the rhythmic thudding. He tried the handle. It was searing hot. Panicked, he raced upstairs for his phone to call 911. That's when he saw it. Her phone, lying on her bedside table. It lit up with an incoming text message, but it was from her phone. The message read, "She is mine now. We will burn together." As he stared at it, his own phone rang. 911, dispatch. But the line went dead almost immediately. In his terror and confusion, he couldn't even recall their new address. He raced back downstairs. The playroom door was now slightly ajar. The burning smell was gone. No smoke, no fire, just an intense, unnatural cold, emanating from within and from under the stairs, the distinct sound of ragged, labored breathing, and the faint glint of eyes watching him from the deepest shadows. Before he could react, Sarah appeared behind him in the hallway, calm, composed, her eyes clear. "Honey, what are you doing?" she asked, her voice normal. "Come to bed. You have work in the morning." He knew then, with a certainty that terrified him more than any ghost, that he had to get them both out of that house, whatever it took. Sarah's own recollection of those final days, as pieced together from her fragmented and increasingly unreliable perspective, paints an even more disturbing picture. She wrote of feeling a new, almost euphoric strength, a clarity she hadn't felt in years. She took a strange pride in small domestic acts, getting the old fireplace in the living room roaring again, installing new heavy-duty locks on their bedroom door and windows. Locks, she noted, with a chilling satisfaction, that could be secured from the outside. She felt a sense of liberation from the outside world, from phones and the internet, believing research into the house's history was now totally unnecessary. She perceived Mark's growing concern not as worry, but as judgment, as him thinking she was crazy. "We are all a little crazy, right?" she mused. "I just let a house get to me is all." Her final entry, or perhaps her final coherent thoughts before the end, are the most harrowing. She spoke of needing me time, time to plan, time to think, away from what she called his prying eyes. She mentioned ensuring he would sleep soundly, undisturbed. She wrote of a secret, an exciting piece of news she couldn't yet share. "I have to leave this place now," she wrote. Then the awareness of sirens growing closer, the smell of smoke, real or imagined, filling her lungs, and her last chilling words, "And smoke can't be good for the twins." What truly happened in that house, what lines were crossed between the psychological and the paranormal, what became of Sarah's twins, or the entities that dwelled within those walls and perhaps within Sarah herself, remains an unresolved horror. The house, Mark says, still stands, a silent monument to the unsettling truth that some places don't just harbor ghosts of the past, but can actively consume the present, twisting love into fear and sanity into something terrifyingly other. No, you didn't misread that title. I do, in fact, clean haunted houses for a living. Well, to be more precise, I oversee the cleaning and maintenance of what you might call spiritually advantaged properties. Houses with territorial personalities, phantom gas stations still pumping out otherworldly fumes, ghostly hotels where the guests never check out, and yes, even those asylums and halfway houses that pop up so often in your whispered tales. It's not just me, of course. I manage a team, usually around 20 or so individuals. That number, I'll admit, tends to fluctuate. Let's just say the employee turnover rate in this particular profession can be spirited. Now, if you're wondering what on earth would possess someone to willingly sign up for a job which, on its best days, routinely exposes them to a myriad of unsettling phenomena, allow me to explain. It wasn't a dramatic summons or a pact signed in flickering candlelight. I got the job like any other. I saw an ad in the local paper for a janitorial position, and I took it. This was about 10 years ago. And the truth is, I didn't even begin to cotton on to the true nature of what I was dealing with until about my second year in. As far as I knew initially, I was just having an extraordinarily bad run of luck with my assignments. I figured they were sending the newbie Me, out on the toughest, grimiest, most dilapidated gigs to test my mettle. Maybe even to try and scare me away. My first few months were certainly an education in the unpleasant. I dealt with rooms that felt like ice caverns in mid-July, strange, viscous ectoplasmic residues that clung to everything, unexplained whispers that seemed to emanate from the very walls, and the occasional disembodied sigh that would follow me down a dark corridor. There were also peculiar stains that resisted all conventional cleaning methods, and an overwhelming sense of oppressive energies that left me drained and jumpy. And sure, it was a little weird that my employer insisted on paying me in unmarked black envelopes, delivered directly to my door in the dead of night. But if that meant keeping certain bureaucratic entities out of my earnings, well, so much the better. I was broke back then, truly broke, living out of a cramped studio apartment with little to occupy my free time, beyond an old, sputtering laptop computer with a terrible internet signal. So I tried to pick up as many hours, as many assignments as possible, because the pay was good. Great, in fact, for what I believed to be specialized janitorial work. After my first year, I'd managed to save enough money to move into a slightly better apartment and acquire a few creature comforts, like my own DSL line and basic cable. Luxuries at the time. But that was also around the time I started to have suspicions. Serious suspicions about what I was actually doing. I had developed a morning ritual for myself, watching one of the local news channels over my morning cup of coffee, brewed in my very own Keurig. Like I said, the job paid surprisingly well. There wasn't a singular eureka moment, no sudden dramatic reveal. Instead, it was a slow, creeping piecing together of various, seemingly unrelated puzzle pieces. A local news report about a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature at an old landmark here. A story about strange lights and unsettling noises reported at an abandoned property there. As these points of public interest continued to, coincidentally, or so I thought, match my recent job sites, I began to realize that there was probably a significant correlation. At first, my mind, scrabbling for a rational explanation, however far-fetched, assumed I was being employed by some sort of clandestine organization, perhaps even the fringes of organized crime, to clean up after, well, messes best left undescribed. This thought, understandably, deterred me from simply quitting. I even considered going to the police for about 30 seconds before I figured that in doing so, I might very well become one of my co-workers' next cleanup jobs. And besides, it's not like I had any definitive proof of anything illegal, not in the conventional sense. Well, actually, I had quite a bit of unusual evidence, strange residues and unidentifiable substances. But that's the kind of denial I was swimming in back then. So I continued my peculiar, messy business for several more years, driving all around the state, and sometimes even across the border, to deal with these increasingly bizarre and energetically charged locations. Eventually, through a combination of diligence, a strong stomach for the unsettling, and perhaps a high tolerance for the inexplicable, I got promoted to superintendent. Apparently, the previous super had finally reached what one might call retirement age in this line of work, and wanted to go spend the rest of his days out in the quiet countryside, far from the job. I tried not to dwell too hard on the fact that my very last cleanup job as a rank-and-file janitor was an old, abandoned farmhouse in a very remote, very quiet part of the country. Being in charge, I discovered, has a lot of perks. For one thing, I no longer have to deal with the direct cleanups myself, except in very special, usually high priority or particularly potent occasions where additional oversight or specialized maintenance is required. Now I get a stack of assignment papers delivered to my door in the middle of the night, sealed in a large, unmarked black envelope, and then I assign them to my crew. I don't oversee their pay. That is presumably handled by our ultimate employer, a figure I had yet to meet. I just tell my crew what job to do, where to go, what specialized cleansing agents or containment equipment they'll need, and any specific sensitivities the location might have. The other significant advantage of being superintendent is that I finally got to have some direct correspondence with our employer. This, more than anything, cemented my suspicions about the exact nature of our work. And it certainly wasn't any mob boss we were working under. Now I know what you're probably thinking. Some ghoulish apparition materializing in a puff of smoke in the middle of the night, ordering me to sell my soul and all that rot. No, nothing quite so melodramatic. She's actually, well, nice might be stretching it, but she's professional. Her name is, or I suppose was, Karen. Yes, she does arrive at my door every Sunday night, precisely at 3 a.m., but she always knocks politely before she, shall we say, phases in. And she's always dressed very professionally, in a smart, if somewhat old-fashioned, pantsuit. I'll admit that the faint, ethereal glow around her, and the way her features sometimes seem to shift, turn, and blur, particularly around her eyes, which hold ancient shadows rather than pupils, can be a bit disturbing. But I swallow my personal thoughts and maintain a professional demeanor. This is the modern era, after all. One must be respectful of other people's unique conditions. So, you're probably wondering why these abodes of the damned, these hotspots of paranormal activity, require cleaning and maintenance at all. It's a fair question. I know I used to assume that such places, or the entities within them, wouldn't really care about tidiness, or, at best, I figured they could probably handle their own energetic upkeep. And to be fair, they probably could, in some fashion. But imagine this. If you're an entity, and you've just had a hard night of, say, intensely focused haunting, rearranging furniture with poltergeist-like fury, projecting terrifying apparitions, or engaging in prolonged sessions of disembodied whispering, you're going to be exhausted, psychically drained. Why wouldn't you get somebody else to tidy up the residual energies and reset the atmosphere for you? It's not like our conventional money has any real value to them directly. Case in point, if you could hire a team of workers to clean your house thoroughly every day, and you only had to pay them in, say, dried leaves or interesting pebbles, would you ever lift a finger to clean again? Our payment, those unmarked envelopes, well, their contents are, let's just say they're valuable in circles you wouldn't normally frequent. And as for the necessity of our job in the grander scheme of things, let me tell you, this is a difficult era to be your average, run-of-the-mill haunted house. Talk about an economic recession. We're practically living in a ghost house recession. People are more informed, and frankly, often misinformed by those sensationalist TV shows, than ever about the supposed reality of spooky dwellings. They're cautious, wary of even the slightest telltale sign of genuine paranormal activity. Sure, you'll always have your reckless, thrill-seeking teenagers and bless their cotton socks. They're the bread and butter for some of our less discerning clients. But for your average consumer, or perhaps consumable would be a more accurate term in some of the more intense locations, metaphorically speaking, of course, they're more aware than ever of the inherent peculiarities of stepping over to the other side, even just for a visit. That's why being a thorough janitor, a meticulous cleaner of these spectral messes, is so critically important in this job. One missed patch of intensely negative psychic residue, an overlooked concentration of ectoplasmic slime, a creepy portrait that wasn't properly energetically neutralized. Any of these oversights can lead to the house not being able to perform optimally that night, not generating the required levels of fear or ambient emotional energy that its occupants, shall we say, subsist on. And let me tell you, our clients, the entities, they appreciate what we do, but when they're hungry or energetically depleted, they get irritable. Yeah, it might seem a bit cruel from an outside perspective, but I like to think of it as incentivizing quality work from my crew. A well-maintained haunt is an effective haunt, and I can probably guess what the more high-minded among you are thinking. How can you work for an organization that essentially facilitates and maintains paranormal activity, potentially preying on human emotions like fear? Well, gee, Brian, I don't know. How can you work for that massive tech company that harvests user data? Susan, tell me all about the products you sell in that big box store that were made in questionable overseas factories. Adrian, how's life working for that financial institution with a history of predatory lending? And don't even get me started on some of the historical actions of various organized belief systems. I do like working with some of them, though. The clergy. They tend to try and cleanse places themselves first, which usually just stirs things up and makes a bigger, more interesting energetic mess for us to sort out later. Very little physical residue, though, which is a plus. My point is, when you work for any large, sprawling entity, whether it's a multinational corporation or a clandestine supernatural service agency, you eventually come to accept that they're probably involved in some sort of ethically gray or even downright shadowy endeavors. But hey, you gotta make a living, right? Unless you can honestly claim to be somebody who has only ever lived a completely cruelty-free, off-the-grid life, which basically means you weave your own clothes from hand-spun nettles, grow all your own food using only rainwater and positive affirmations, and entertain yourself exclusively by skipping rocks on a secluded pond. We all just have to do what little we can to try and improve the lot we're in, or at least make it bearable. I do try to balance my karmic ledger in some small ways. I donate a portion of my rather generous income to various mundane charities. I do some volunteer community service, picking up litter in the park, that sort of thing. And I've even managed to convince Karen, my boss, to start letting me subtly misplace certain spiritually significant items I sometimes uncover on the job, items that might tie a particularly confused or benign spirit to a location. I leave them in places where they might eventually be discovered by, say, compassionate paranormal researchers or sensitive individuals who can help that spirit find some kind of peace or move on. You know, so some of these lingering echoes can get some closure. I think that's a nice gesture. Of course, the trunk of my car will never smell the same again from transporting some of these energetically charged artifacts. That's for sure. You see any local news reports about some historian randomly discovering an ancient, previously unknown relic in a field, or a family finding a strangely comforting but unidentifiable heirloom under the floorboards of their new home. Yeah, that might have been my doing. A little unauthorized spiritual rehoming. Now, what about those of you out there who might be intrigued? Perhaps interested in becoming a cleaner for my rather unique service? Well, let me tell you, it's not always easy to spot our recruitment ads. Times have changed since I first stumbled into this line of work. We usually prefer to advertise on the internet these days. It's far easier to be inconspicuous when you're awash in a vast sea of similar-sounding janitorial or specialized cleaning service ads. I help write the adverts sometimes, but we usually all stick to the same kind of buzzwords: high-paying, flexible hours, and exciting career opportunities often accompany what would otherwise just be a boilerplate ad for a night shift cleaner. Let me tell you right now, I'm not interested in mere thrill seekers. Yes, I know the job sounds glamorous and exciting to you nutters out there who like the idea of wandering around macabre scenery with a proton pack. We don't use proton packs, by the way. Mostly specialized vacuums and neutralizing sprays. But this is a very demanding cleanup job, often involving meticulous work in highly unsettling environments, with a rigorous and strict timetable. If you can do a good job cleansing a room thick with palpable dread and despair, or neutralizing a persistent cold spot that drains the life out of everything around it, without having a complete meltdown, oh, strong stomachs and even stronger nerves are an absolute must, then I can probably use you on my team. If you can get a job done in a timely manner, follow precise instructions without unnecessary exploring, and generally avoid goofing off, or heaven forbid, trying to communicate with the clientele, then you might just be a valuable employee. Just keep browse those late-night job boards, those obscure forums. You'll eventually stumble upon our advert. We offer competitive starting pay, a surprisingly robust range of health benefits, mostly covering psychological counseling, if I'm honest, and an unexpectedly good life insurance policy. We don't have a 401k, though. For most of us here, long-term retirement planning seems like kind of a moot point. Who knows, if you stick with it, follow the protocols, and don't lose your mind, you might even make it to superintendent one day. But I do plan on sticking around for a good while longer myself. Yeah, the nightly psychic wailing from the residual energies of those places whose spiritual messes I used to clean up personally do get a little bit grating after a decade, but I found that a good industrial-grade white noise machine and a high-quality memory foam mattress can make you forget about just about anything. And yes, there is that creepy little girl apparition who keeps staring at me through every reflective surface I happen to glance at, no matter where I am. A souvenir from a particularly nasty hotel job years ago. But you'd be surprised what you can get used to. And that, pretty much, is the name of the game in this profession. If the money is good and the benefits are decent, you'd be absolutely amazed how much unsettling weirdness and psychic slime and cold spots and disembodied whispers you can learn to put up with. It's just another day at the office, really. Or, well, someone else's very, very strange office.